present the concept of institutionalization. And can you see the full screen? Okay, great. And particularly the way it has been discussed in contemporary art discourse. The term itself, as described by artist and writer Dave Beach in 2006, is considered to be a taboo word. While the everyday usage of the term institutionalization can hold a connotation of maturity and responsibility, institutionalization within an art context bears the idea of compromise and defeat, as it signifies a measure of neutralizing or co-opting a subversive artwork, style, or movement. And my presentation on the way institutionalization has been conceptualized in the art discourse will focus on more recent work by art practitioners and scholars. Although discussions that consider art as an institution and art's role in society goes back many, many years. For example, around the 18th century with the emergence of the private gallery system and the art market, as well as the public and national museums. Here I am interested in elaborating on what I perceive to be a shift in the way institutionalization has largely been thought of. And as I will further elaborate, that changing attitude towards certain strategies of institutionalization can be explained by political and material changes within the art world and the other system that support it, such as the global market and the nation state. So returning back to the taboo on institutionalization, I would like to start by laying out some of the historical foundation for this framing, which derives from the opposite side of art as an institution, and this is art's relation with revolutionary thinking and praxis. So early calls to transform the work of art, to transform the work of art into something that is more sublime or revolutionary or radical can be found in, for example, in the text of German romanticists, whether it's the writing of Schiller in the late 18th century or Wagner in the mid-19th century. And in their writing, we can identify call to revolutionize art, both internally and externally, something that will be reiterated and further developed in later avant-garde art practices. The inner revolution of art has to do with rethinking art's unique qualities and its relationship with life, and developing new artistic styles and movement that move beyond the strict hierarchies and genres, techniques as judgment as determined by institutions such as the Art Academy, our history department, the museum, and the Institution of Art Criticism. So thinking about Impressionist art or Cubism, these are examples for internally revolutionized art. And another aspect of art's relation with revolutionary thinking is external. It has to do with the perception that art's capacity to achieve an authentic experience of humanity can only occur within a broader context of political revolution. So Wagner, Art and Revolution was written following the failure of the Dresden Revolt in 1849. It was part of the springtime of nations aiming to replace the old monarchy with new liberal and democratic political structures. And in this text, Wagner argues that the promise of a true art cannot emerge within current society as long as art is considered to be an industrial institution. So art's revolutionary impulse, its negation of industrial or bourgeois society and the artistic doctrine which it dictates, was further conceptualized and practiced in 20th century avant-garde movement. We're talking about specifically Dada and Surrealism, but also the Russian suprematism and Russian symbolic theater. Here we can find a full articulation of the critique of art as an institution through both acts of negation, negating what considered to be art so far, and recreating artistic experience, agency, and object. Within the context of the avant-garde, art has been imagined as a collective and non-professionalized activity that is integrated within the praxis of life. So we can think about negating the labor of art by taking ready-made objects and place them in museum, or by creating mass reenactment of historical revolutionary moments in history, such as the reenactment of the storming of the Winter Palace in Russia post the revolution. The aspect of integrating art within the practice of everyday life is probably considered to be the most difficult one to define. And since then, it has become the main focal point of criticism of the avant-garde and in its ability to achieve such integration without losing art's political and institutional critique. This critique of the avant-garde was mostly famously articulated by Peter Burger in his text Theory of the Avant-Garde, but can be found also in the work of conceptual and new avant-garde theories such as Hal Foster, Alexander Albero, Rosalind Krauss, and Abigail Salomon Goudreau. So the admittance of the failure of the historic avant-garde, a failure that was manifested in the co-optation of the avant-garde critique on art as an institution by the art institution themselves, has led to some sort of an acknowledgement that institutionalization is an inherent feature in modern and contemporary art. Nonetheless, contemporary art discourse is continuously concerned with the search for the next avant-garde movements that will offer alternative paths for art making and engagement beyond what has been become possible under the current marketization of the arts and the economization of the everyday life. Such concerns have gained traction since the 1990s and more strongly since 2000, as more art practitioners have become conscious of art ties with the economic field. And this is an observation that was made, for example, in the exhibition Economy by Angela Dimitrakaki and Kirsten Lloyd, that present different types of engagement and artistic reaction to the globalized art market, or alternative modes of production that can challenge that economic hegemony. The question of the feasibility of the avant-garde practice within today's artists has then become separable from the question of art as an institution, for conceptual, political, and infrastructural reasons that I will outline now. So avant-garde theorists and scholars such as Burger have understood that historic avant-garde as a singular event. The reason historic avant-garde had such a profound impact on the history of art was because of the initial shock that it produced, such as in the case of provocative performances on stage and on the streets by the Italian futurists that create this interactive, chaotic, theatrical events, also the participatory and public events organized by Paris Dada. Despite the framing of the avant-garde as a singular event, later contemporary theories such as Claire Bishop, Chantal Mouffe, and Jacques Rancière have identified shock and provocation as necessary qualities for articulating and revealing new critical insights on the contemporary art institutions and the socio-political system that sustains it. In the case, the hegemony of neoliberalism and the market economy. Challenging the therapeutic shock, as critically referred to by art historian Grant Kester, can be found in the work of critical scholars who are engaged with Marxist, feminist, and queer theories. Kester, for example, relies on Yves Kosofsky-Sedgwick's critique of the paranoid that has become the privileged mode of producing knowledge amongst creative and intellectuals, and he uses it in order to build critical framework that evaluate works of art through ethical prism of empathy and communication. Similarly, in the work of Kirsten Lloyd, we can find emphasis on practices of care rather than provocation and shock, and the prioritization of characteristics such as attentiveness, openness, directedness, and empathic responsiveness that enable to build creative framework for mutual learning and support. And she brings different types of example of artistic art-led initiative that aim to kind of mobilize or empower marginalized groups such as unemployed single mother or poor communities in the US through artistic means, through artistic strategies. More recently, Shelley Cohen published her monograph on the ethics of care in architecture, exploring 3 modes of practicing care in the processes of designing and building new social infrastructure for communities in need in Israel-Palestine, whether it's the Jalim tribe in Palestine or the community of asylum seeker and migrant workers in Tel Aviv, through creating alternative infrastructure that provide services that have been excluded from them by the state. Moving to another entanglement between avant-garde theory and practices of institutionalization is the relation between negation and affirmation. Historical avant-garde has largely been understood in terms of negation. The purpose of this negation was to create a clean slate for new experimentation that will prepare the ground for a different type of artistic experience that is embedded within an everyday life and can be explored by anyone. However, what was maintained in the process of incorporating avant-garde into the art canon is solely the idea of negation. Furthermore, Bugge reflects on the cynical way in which the avant-garde promised to reintegrate art with the practice of everyday life received a capitalist interpretation in the form of consumerist culture and popular entertainment. He even suggests that perhaps it would be best to keep art as an autonomous activity that adopt a critical but external position on capitalist modes of production without trying to change it. And this is something that we can find in artistic and institutional statements nowadays that acknowledge the prefigurative role of art to imagine, build, and practice democratic and progressive models and relations that are not yet ready to be brought into full realization in the real world. However, an artistic mode of organization that we are seeing in the past decade suggests not only the return of art into sites of political dissent, but also the making of the art institution a site of struggle. And this is seen through acts of boycotting, occupying, and unionizing by art organization and collectives such as Occupy Museum, Decolonize Displays, Wage Art and Labor, and Art Not Oil Coalition. This is not just an attempt to align art with progressive movements for racial, economic, and ecological justice, but to act upon the avant-garde promise to transform the art institution itself. What I think is important to take from the core moment of mobilization within the art world is the realization that not only artists cannot work against the system alone, but if the system is an encompassing thing, that simply creating art outside the museum will not necessarily advance avant-garde vision, especially with the increasing role of other actors in the co-opting of the creative spirit. The current system, where most artists do not work in proximity to the established art sites, leads to the evaluation of the meaning of integrating art into life. Here it is not enough to just promote independent, artist-led, autonomous spaces just for the sake of artistic freedom that is detached from the established art institution. This does not mean that these spaces are independent necessarily from the logic of the market or the state. Such realization, however, should not lead us back to the inevitable fate of critical cultural work, but rather to push forward what Beach calls institutionalization for all. And in the last few minutes I have, I just would like to suggest possible direction from which to further think about this call for institutionalization for all and the challenges that such call might pose, particularly when examining this call in different geopolitical contexts. So these last thoughts are very much work in progress. So I kind of hope that this will be a good platform for further discussion and hopefully feedback as well. Despite the transformative potential that the call institutionalization for all holds, the majority of works and discussion around it are very much informed by modern contemporary art developments within US and Eurocenters. The majority of case studies demonstrating success stories of radical institutionalization are anchored within alternative and the critical New York art scene. Furthermore, the intellectual tradition that informs acts of institutionalization for all centers around specific ideas about what constitutes an ideal civil society, public space, political and artistic action that are then assumed on a range of geopolitical landscape. Drawing from what can be described as decentralized or decolonize our histories might help us not only identify different creative lineages and manifestation of political form. So I'm thinking about the discussion in the first panel to develop path that we can think about different types of manifestation of political imagination in places or through objects that we are not necessarily associate with artistic creation that are tied to political struggle or political agenda. And that kind of creative lineages also encourage us to expand and interrogate the concept of practices of agency and social transformation as well. Another direction draws from other disciplines where the question of institutionalization of radical, critical, and relative practices is a central concern. There are usually close ties between art critique and political theory. However, I believe one can find other possibility for critically engaging and analyzing practices of institutionalization for all in the field of cultural geography. Here I rely on research on everyday activism by Jenny Pickerel and Paul Chatterton, the concept of spatial activism developed by Chen Misgav, and studies examining the intersection of geography and art, including the work of Harriet Hawkins and John Sharp. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of the work on processes of institutionalization has situated critical or avant-garde practices in binary and dialectic way. So it either work against the system or help supporting it, and also conceptualize these practices as singular or temporal events. The field of geography, and more specifically cultural and political geography, offers tools from which to examine the materiality of institutionalization, meaning how practices of institutionalization for all are interwoven within everyday social and urban fabric, what are the spatial dimension of social and political forms of art, and how it is being used to realize and shape new spaces and communities. In other words, exploring the material and spatial dimension of institutionalization can help us continuing from where most research on radical or avant-garde practices end, meaning with the disappearance or canonization of such practices. Then combining it with decentralized approaches to art, it will be possible then to develop a more complex understanding of the dynamics, processes, and nuances of institutionalization and alternative infrastructure in which critical art can emerge and flourish. So, thank you.